All right, today is July 20th in 2026, and my guest is Reason. Reason is the co-founder and CEO of Repair Biotechnologies, a longevity industry veteran, and an astrophysicist by background,
Once upon a time.
once upon a time. And today we're going to talk about clinical trials. We talk about what it means to be in one, because there's one going on in Prosper right now that Reason is part of. And also what it means to do clinical trials as part of being a biotech entrepreneur, the kind of barriers that you have to navigate. So Reason, welcome to the show.
Appreciate it. Thank you. So where should we start?
Well, tell us a bit about yourself and how do you get from astrophysics to longevity to normal biotech now, and what does that jump mean?
Whatever normal biotech is. Yes. So, astrophysics and medicine, there really isn't an awful lot of difference at the high level. They're both studying things that are enormously complex, about which we know tiny fractions of what's going on. Factor of two answers are generally acceptable, thumbs up. And you're attempting to operate in an environment of a lot of unknown and try and hack away the undergrowth somewhat. So it wasn't enormously different, frankly. It's
Mhm.
just stars and people.
But is the experimental methods kind of similar or different, right? Because you have kind of smaller sample sizes in biological systems versus observing the physical
Well,
world. And
there's no real analogy in astrophysics to the getting a bunch of mice and then seeing what happens when you try the same therapy in them. But the rest of it is similar. All you can do is observe. You have this laboratory out there, it's doing its thing, and you have a limited amount of opportunity to change it. And I guess the biggest difference there would be indeed the existence of clinical trials. You think of astrophysics as epidemiology writ large. You're looking at the epidemiology of things in the universe. In humans, you look at the epidemiology of humans and you look at why they die and what that correlates with, and then you try and formulate hypotheses. And then you stick medicines in them and see what happens. And it's the sticking medicines in them that's the thing you can't do on the astrophysics side all that easily. So not for a while yet, anyway.
Mhm. But what made you decide to do a company specifically in longevity or in biotech?
Well, you can blame my co-founder for that. He talked me into it. I think absent my co-founder, Bill Sherman, I would have continued doing what I was doing, which was helping out nonprofits and having a nice, comfy tech industry job, and writing Fight Aging and continuing to educate myself on the biology side of things. So on the whole, good. Good job, Bill, for getting me to do that.
Good. And what is it like? So we're here in Prosper right now, and why are you here right now? What's going on?
And boy, is it hot here. Yes.
Mm.
So I'm here right now, just at this time, to participate in a clinical trial that's being run by Unlimited Bio, which is a collection of radical Russian guys who are attempting to bring some of what's going on in medical tourism into a better state for the FDA and the regulated side of the house. As you may or may not know, for the last, going on 20 years now, people have been doing simple gene therapies in the medical tourism space, trying primarily follistatin, to a lesser degree telomerase gene therapies. And the follistatin one has really kicked off because, relatively, there's a lot of people who've had it. There's a number of groups who are doing it using simple AAV injections that are not systemic. They're learning a lot about how to make this work that hasn't been learned in the mainstream community, because the mainstream community has no real interest or incentive in doing these sort of muscle growth gene therapies in the way that's being done outside. So sadly, that means that most of the information out there is just never going to come to light, because medical tourism clinics have no incentive whatsoever to publish what they're doing. And so it's like stem cell therapy for the last 30 something years. Enormous amounts of work have been done. Lots of groups have developed a really sort of sound empirical practice, and they have their own sort of secrets and recipes, and they will never ever share those with the rest of the world because there's no financial incentive for them to do so. So then along come some other people and say, "Well, you guys are doing all this. Let's take this and try and put it somewhere and put it into the mainstream system and do trials and publish the results." And sooner or later, you get leakage out of the medical tourism space into the mainstream space, because somebody finds the attempt to do it. But the challenge there is that, for most people, the money just isn't there to do it. So Unlimited Bio is sort of splitting the knot here, doing something that's in the middle of the two. They're coming to Prospera to be able to do a medical tourism cost trial using, formal FDA style processes. And that doesn't actually cost that much more than not doing it that way. And they make use of the local medical resources here that are already very set up for clinical tourism. And off they go. And the hope is at the end of the day, you have something you can put in front of the FDA and they won't like throw you out just because you did it outside the US. And there's a history of people who have done this in Eastern Europe, in Canada, in Mexico. And it's all just, down to the rigor. You have to be sufficiently rigorous that the FDA will not look at you and say, okay, you're a bunch of cowboys. Um, to give them a chance to say, okay, despite the fact that this didn't happen in the US, we're gonna look at this. Please don't do it again, but we'll look at this. That's kind of what the best you can hope for at the moment. And then ultimately, like as happened for stem cell therapies, eventually the FDA throws up their hands and people start doing more of it and it gets more widely accepted and off you go.
Yeah. So what was your experience with this trial that rigor is there that could get it accepted?
My experience is they're taking a hell of a lot of blood from me on a very regular basis, and that's a part of it. That's think about how many tests you'd want to run on somebody who just had an AAV follistatin gene therapy, and now multiply the time by 6 and the number of tests by 5, and off you go. So a lot of testing, a lot of like over caution, we should say. Um, for a therapy that's reasonably assured just from a practical point of view to be safe.
Mhm. So there's a lot to unpack here, and for anyone who's new to this podcast and who doesn't have that background, so we're here in Prosper in a special jurisdiction on an island called Roatán. That's part of the country of Honduras. So it's a 2-hour flight out from Miami, and I think you made it here from the Bay Area. No, New
No,
York,
New
right?
York, New York, New York.
Yeah, so from New York to Miami and then here. So not that far. And the reason described us doing, or Unlimited Bio doing a clinical trial here under the Prosper legal system, not under the ordinary Honduran legal system. And there's some interesting features about that. There's a clinic here called the GARM Clinic. And you were just describing, all right, very often these clinics that are offshore, they have these treatments, cell therapy and gene therapy treatments, stem cells, but we got very little data on them, right? And what you're describing now, that's interesting. It's a cost trial. Can you say more about what a cost trial is?
This is patient paid to a certain degree, and it helps reduce the costs. So these guys are doing a very sort of smart, bootstrapping, low cost approach to try to take the therapies they're interested in, which is this follistatin gene therapy and an existing Russian therapy that hasn't yet sort of made the leap into the Western world, which is a VEGF gene therapy to grow blood vessels for people who don't have enough of them. So they're doing these in a very cost-effective way. Partially, you have the patients take on some of the cost of getting here or doing the tests, and you pay for the therapy, and it makes it possible to do this for, let's say, a few $1 million for 12 to 20 patients, and that's a reasonable sort of let's say phase 0 trial. With the FDA, you go phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 traditionally, where phase 1 is a safety. But you can do a phase 0, which is something that doesn't rise to the level of what the FDA would consider a big enough phase 1, but you can do it at a lower cost. The FDA will still look at it, give an opinion, and then you can go raise enough money to do it, quote, properly, unquote, the way the FDA would like you to do it with the infinite overkill on testing.
So the current one is a phase 0 that they're doing here right now.
I mean, effectively, I think they're going to try and present it as a phase 1. Whether that works or not, we'll see.
Yeah, but they could, with that data, potentially raise more money to do a proper
Yes,
phase
exactly.
1.
I mean, at the end of the day, the whole point of this and the thing that a lot of investors are really leery about is, does your therapy actually work in humans? Because the vast majority of things that people try are actually not that great. And there's a whole other discussion to be had about why does the biotech pharmaceutical development community generate crappy therapies that only work in mice and don't work well in humans. And when they do work in humans, they are not that good. There's a whole story there about why that exists. Just take that as being read. This is the way it is. So the FDA exists to tell the difference between marginally okay therapies and marginally bad therapies. And this takes a lot of work, and they're inundated by these things. And investors too. So investors, there's biotech companies before they've done a human trial, there's sort of a big lemon problem going on there because a lot of them just aren't good. And when you have done the human data, well, a whole different world. Now you've demonstrated that your thing works, it does what you said it did, and now you can go talk to different investors, raise a bunch of money, do things much more sort of rigorously and with greater expense.
Yeah. So why can't you do that like phase zero, very cheap, or at cost or cost pricing in the United States?
Well, I mean, there's a long story there, and part of it is the Institutional Review Board. Part of it is the FDA. So every institution, well, every time you put something into humans, you have to get a clinic, a hospital, a something, to a doctor to agree to do this. And that means the Institutional Review Board at the institution they're at has to agree to do this. And it
If it's
almost
human subject research,
human
right? Not if
subject
it's
research,
medical
yes.
practice. Yeah.
And in almost all cases, they will just say no. Or you're going to be required to produce the same evidence that you would have given to the FDA saying, I have manufactured this thing to, to the point of ridiculous expense to ensure safety. I have effectively produced the material. I've gone to the FDA. But what in practice happens is if you haven't gone to the FDA, if you don't have an IND filed with the FDA with everything that involves, the vast expense that involves, then the answer is just no, you're not doing this in the US. There are a few exceptions to that rule.
Because I was
But
wondering, because IRBs actually, you know, are operating under the common rule, and it's not that difficult to register as an IRB, right? And they can be for-profit, non-for-profit. They can be in-house to a clinic or to a site, or they can be external, right? So I was wondering, isn't there like a commercial market for an IRB that finds you kind of a site where they would approve that you could do this?
yeah, no, the reason why that doesn't happen in the US is roughly the FDA, or at least the rules propagated by the FDA. And worse than that, not just the rules propagated by the FDA, but the set of understanding of what those rules actually mean in detail for any given type of therapy that doesn't really exist within the FDA. It exists in a sort of diffuse cloud of consulting organizations and tens of thousands of consultants outside the FDA who have sort of decided what this means. And changing any of this is very hard. And anybody who does something, well, the big risk is that if you do something that doesn't toe with this framework, and then somebody dies, and
And you have
often
like malpractice,
they're
tort
you know
liability kind of risk.
death of your organization
Yeah.
type of risk. I mean, you can look at this. If you look at what happened to Quadrant Clinical Medicine in the
Mhm.
Caribbean last year, from the outside, it's impossible. They took a cancer therapy that's pretty innocuous. It's based on filtering blood, so they
Mhm.
filter the blood in a sort of apheresis type way. And the people who were getting this therapy and paying for it in a sort of patient paid exercise, they were obviously people who've fallen out of the bottom of the cancer system in the US. They didn't have any other options, very high mortality risk. And of course, a number of them died. And that company probably no longer exists. And they were certainly, they've been excoriated in the press for for a year now. And it's quite likely that they did everything right. But nonetheless, because they didn't use the system in the US, the purpose of which is not necessarily to ensure safety, but to absolve guilt when something does go wrong, as it inevitably will, then, that's your organization dead. Everybody you worked with has tremendous reputational damage, and there's strong incentives to avoid this. So you have this sort of trio of things propping each other up. You have the FDA, you have extreme risk averse behavior amongst those with the most to lose, like particularly hospitals and clinics and physicians, principal investigators, and this diffuse cloud of how do you do this properly information that is sort of a consensus across a lot of people, too many to actually have any sort of part of it jump up and say, no, actually, I think we should do it this much easier way, because they'll get shouted down by the rest. And if you look at Australia as the alternative to that, Australia does have IRBs for hire, and the IRBs are not associated with specific organizations. And the government has said, okay, we wash our hands of this. It's all up to you guys. You want to run clinical trials? It's up to you, the sites and the IRBs, to figure this out. It's on you if it goes wrong. Then you do have a plurality of opinions in that circumstance. You can go shopping. You can go to say, okay, guys, what do you think of this? And get different opinions from different hospitals. And the hospitals are looking out for the patients and themselves. and the IRBs are looking out for the patients and their own reputations. And so in principle, that produces, the best possible outcome somewhere in that galaxy of options you have, where somebody says, okay, I think that the rest of this is overkill. We could do it this way responsibly. You don't have to do this other problem. And meanwhile, in the US, with the centralization of that system, you have a very, very strong ratchet effect on any new thing that's proposed. So any so, so the FDA puts out very broad guidelines. They say the FDA guidelines mostly amount to do this sensibly. Nowhere in the FDA guidelines will you see any sort of information on how, for example, in detail, you should manufacture and quality control messenger RNA.
Mhm.
It's not there.
Mhm.
That knowledge is within the grand scope of companies and consultants, and they do actually have a consensus as to how you should manufacture it and what you should be testing. And if you think that one part of that is wrong, guess what? The FDA is going to say, wait, there's a consensus here. Why are you not doing this thing?
Mm.
And if somebody comes along and proposes something new and says, I think we should be even more safe. Let's do this extra piece of work over here that's going to double the cost of manufacture. The FDA will say, thumbs up. Can't possibly have too much work here. And that will gradually work its way into the system. So the ratchet effect means that it's very, very hard to go back from what is currently thought of as adequate. Whereas, talk to anybody off the record in the manufacturing field, for example, about AAV, you could manufacture AAV in the same way people do it for
Let's
animal
talk a bit
studies.
more about AAV
Yeah.
and gene therapy. Like, what is it, and what are the
Okay.
implications for like
Yes.
the
Yes. Yes.
manufacturing and GMP and the
So AAV is the adeno-associated virus. It's a non-replicating virus that's it's very well established. You could, if you wanted a human, a human gene in an AAV package, and you wanted enough of it to dose a human, you could literally go to Vector Builder or any one of a number of other companies and say, give me this thing. And provided you have a lab address to ship it to, they wouldn't blink twice. They'll make it up. They'll run a few QC tests on it. They'll ship it to you, and 95% of the time it will actually work. And the remaining 5% is why you test in an animal or you test in cells first. And an AAV virus, it just goes into a cell. It produces some plasmids. The plasmids sit in the nucleus. They express the gene that they encode for, and they don't alter. They don't much alter, or not very often alter, the actual nuclear DNA itself, and they last for like maybe 10, 15 years in tissues, maybe. I mean, or lifetime. We're not at the point where we know how long exactly they last, but largely permanently is the goal. So the manufacturing has been going on for years and years and years and years and years. It's only really used in the mainstream clinic with approved therapies through the European Medical Agency or the FDA, for rare diseases where you're giving it to like a 5-year-old child and it costs $1 million to manufacture it, and it's very hard to do. But that's very different from what's going on in the medical tourism space, where you're injecting it into one muscle, not into a vein, and it just goes to a local part of the body, and it's much, much, much safer.
Yeah. So AAV is a delivery method for gene therapy.
It is a delivery method, one of many. At present, there are not very many delivery methods that actually work well enough to. There are infinite delivery methods that work well enough to use in a mouse. But when it comes to using it in a human, you have AAV, and you have lipid nanoparticles delivering a messenger RNA or some other form of RNA, like as simple interfering, small interfering RNA. And that's really it that's made it into the clinic. But there's infinite other possibilities. The challenge with gene therapy is largely that delivery systems suck. It's very hard to deliver reliably to anything other than a few different organs. You certainly can't deliver something to the whole body properly. You can get something into parts of the brain reliably using intranasal injections.
Eyes work pretty well. Right?
Eyes work pretty well. The liver works great because everything always goes to the liver if you inject it intravenously. And the liver therapies are why AAV intravenously is out of favor these days, because a number of patients died like 5 or 6 years ago in a trial with a liver disease. So it's very hard to do gene therapy for intravenous, anything that's really high dose. You really have to come in there and very comprehensively demonstrate to the FDA that you're not about to repeat what happened back then, but local small doses.
Mhm.
That's very plausible. And, in the next 10 years, I would imagine we'll start to see AAV therapies leaking out of the medical tourism community into the US in a limited way, in the same way that, stem cells for inflammation came into the medical community in the US. Like, how long ago was that now? Like 10 years, something like that. It took a long time,
Yeah.
but they've been around for a while now. You can just
Mhm.
go get that done in
Yeah,
many
and you said
clinics.
that it's typically been used for rare diseases and cost like $1 million per dose. So
Yeah.
why does it cost that much? I heard it's
Well,
often a problem in.
because, well, one, the GMP, the good manufacturing practice is just it's just really overkill. It's very, very, very expensive. And that the most expensive gene therapy for, like, where you're putting it into a child because they have a broken gene and you're hoping to get it mostly through enough of their body or in the tissues that matter to actually replace that gene. And this mostly works. Um, in that case, I think the one that's $2 million or so per child is that one takes a 100,000 square foot facility like 40 days to produce one dose under
And why is that?
under good manufacturing practice.
Yeah.
If they weren't doing good manufacturing practice, they could probably do it at a tenth of that cost.
Mhm.
So it's very expensive, very difficult to make it with the quality that people want um, within the regulatory system. For quality that's sufficient for Australia, very easy. Again,
Mhm.
like just there's a thing that's called bridging, which is what you do with an early batch of your drug where you haven't made it under good manufacturing practice, where good manufacturing practice involves every single step, has like massive paperwork, massive checks, massive, QC. Instead, you just run through the whole thing and then QC it at the end. You just run you run the same set of tests that you would run on the finished product out of a GMP batch on
Regulation
the,
by outcomes as opposed
yes.
to inputs or process steps.
Yes, yes, and the other thing to consider about GMP is that it's not just the end product that's conducted under GMP. Everything that's an input to that product has to be manufactured under GMP as well.
Every
Eventually,
input to.
every input to your GMP step has to be GMP unless you can successfully argue with the FDA that it shouldn't. Obviously, at some point, things stop being GMP because otherwise it would be silly. But in the case of lipid nanoparticles, for example, where you're essentially throwing messenger RNA or some other type of RNA and a bunch of lipids into a vat and you're stirring it with a big stick, it's not much more complicated than that, actually.
Mm.
The pumping and stuff is more complicated, but the every one of those lipids has to be manufactured at GMP. So, and you have to pay the expense for the fact that every one of those lipids, and when we say a lipid is manufactured at GMP, making a lipid is a number of chemical reactions, right? You have to do chemistry. And some number of those chemistry reactions were conducted under GMP conditions, and some weren't. And okay, so then you ask them, is this acceptable? Generally, the FDA, in the matter of lipid nanoparticles, is going to say, okay, we don't care how many steps of GMP were done in the making of your lipid. We just don't. Just make sure it's GMP. And then the final process of mixing and QC is all GMP, and that's good. But that's for lipid nanoparticles. That's the answer that the community has come to there. And the answer can be completely different for some other sort of chemistry that produces, let's say, a small molecule. For a small molecule, they might say, no, we actually want these reagents to also be GMP. We don't care about that reagent. We want you to do you have three-step chemistry to produce your end result. We want every single one of those steps to be out of GMP. And these are all wrestling matches you have with your regulatory consultants who want everything to be GMP,
Mhm.
and the FDA who has an opinion, but you don't know what it's going to be until you talk to them.
And it's expensive to talk
And
to them.
and
It
it's
takes a very
expensive to
long time
talk to
until
them,
you
and
get them even.
it's expensive to do 3 steps of GMP versus
Yeah.
1. And this is the, and there's no right answer
Yeah.
other than, you can always overshoot.
Yeah.
And then now you're the ratchet. Because somebody else is going to come along and say, I want to do something similar to this, but I only want to do 1 GMP. And then the consultant's going to say, wait, but this other guy over here did 3 steps of GMP. And this is how you end up where we
Yeah.
are.
You said something before in comparing it to Australia. That makes me think it's about the culture, how it's done in the United States versus Australia. Because I found it actually quite interesting that we're talking right now about the notification pathway in Australia, right? So when you do a phase 1, you basically tell the FDA or the TGA in Australia that you do it, but the approval, you don't need to wait for the approval. The approval comes kind of from the ethics board. But interestingly, that's actually also the case in the United States, right? Because there is like a 30-day response time that you have. But in practice, the FDA just doesn't defer to whatever is like the IRB or whatever that approves it. And they just don't take that judgment, right? So versus in Australia, they just say, all right, we don't intervene unless it's really exceptional circumstances. We just let people sort it out, as you said.
Yes. So, I mean, the
And
US
I
has the
think you're also
culture of risk
doing your
aversion.
trial
Sure.
in Australia, right? So I was wondering if you can compare that a bit from firsthand
Well,
experience.
it's the Australian trial thing is basically you can do it at half the cost.
Mm-mm,
And some of that half the cost is because you can do it 6 to 12 months faster.
mm-mm,
Because the FDA is very slow and they have to be involved at all points of your process of getting up to a trial. Whereas in Australia, a site can be ready to do your clinical trial 6 months after you started talking to them if your ducks are all lined up. And that timing is a big part of it. But also the other part of it is that they will accept what is called GMP-like for your drug, and GMP-like is what I just talked about with bridging. So GMP-like and bridging are roughly the same thing, but again, it's every drug is different in its manufacture, and you have to go to the IRB in Australia and say, "I'm going to do it this way." And nominally, this way means here is my plan if I was going to do this in the US. And here are what my QC tests would look like for my drug after it's manufactured. If I was doing this in the US, all I'm going to do is just going to manufacture this at development grade responsibly, and then run those GMP tests at the end,
mm-mm.
and that's called GMP-like. And Australia is totally fine with you doing that. That's their culture, and of course, this is all ossified there in the same way. It's a consensus in the same way as the US's situation is a consensus that's emerged. Australia is a safe option because they run some ridiculous percentage of all the clinical trials in the world run in Australia now. So nobody gets fired for going to do their clinical trial in Australia, provided you do these things the way you do. Everybody else has done them, and ultimately, it's a responsibility diffusion mechanism that says, okay, we agree that if somebody dies while you're doing this, then you did the best you could, and there you go. But it's still the case that nobody wants people to die in their clinical trials, and people go out of their way to really, really avoid patient groups who have any meaningful risk of death whatsoever.
Yeah,
Because if a patient, regardless of whether you're in Australia or the US, if a patient ups and dies during your clinical trial, that is a big problem.
yeah,
That you now have to, that is a big problem and possibly a showstopper for your company, regardless of why it happened.
yeah.
It's a big problem.
Yeah, it's like the part of the regulatory safety paradox, right? So increase the safety regulation for like a protected group, and you make it more expensive and risky for industry to serve them,
Yep.
right? So same like patients that are at risk of dying, right? So that means it's risky for you to treat them.
So this is why nobody tests drugs for age-related conditions in actual old people.
Mm-mm-mm.
They go find people who have early onset of that condition in their 50s and 60s, where they have that you're fairly okay. You're probably not going to drop dead tomorrow, but nobody wants to run clinical trials on 80-year-olds and 90-year-olds if they can possibly avoid it, because those people might drop dead tomorrow, and if they do, that's your whole trial thrown in the trash can, probably,
Mm-mm.
regardless of why it happened. And cancer has similar problems and similar perverse incentives, because the people you want to help the most are the ones that are really going to mess up your reputation.
Yeah. Yeah, which is kind of like you could get cynical about that, right? Because that means you're doing the trial to pass a trial and not really to find out whether it actually works, right? And uh, like, for example, you have in many of these trials, you have these very strict exclusion criteria. Like one of them is that people have all these like risks associated with it. And typically, those lists are very long. They're also emerging from some consensus, right? So the IRB gives you like 80 or 100 exclusion criteria. Right, so that means you end up with a super narrow, clean sample of the patient population, right?
Exactly,
Which is not representative of the real patient
which is why
population.
everybody can pass a phase 2.
Yeah.
There's another sort of,
Say
if
more.
we
Why
if
is
we
that?
it's okay. In a phase one is safety. You always, unless you really messed up, you always pass your phase one because you're pretty assured already that your drug is going to do that.
Mhm.
A phase two, you're taking a very small section of the patient population, and and every company will stack that deck
Mhm.
to the best they can.
Mm.
So and then phase three is the real test because now you're going out into the real world, and now you're meeting the full variability of the patient population.
Mm.
And many drugs just do not translate from phase two to phase three, even though there is a patient population that they will serve quite adequately. It's just that at that point, nobody's interested in segmenting that patient population because they don't understand it well enough. Pharma is just looking for that hit that works for pretty much everybody, and they're willing to throw out everything that doesn't. So you see any number of drugs passing phase two and failing phase three. And if we're going to be cynical about this, part of the reason this three-stage system looks the way it does is because investors get out somewhere around the phase two mark. Drug passes phase two, investors get their reward. So people with money are influencing the system and the way it works such that they can invest in companies early, get out at phase two, and they don't care whether the drug works or not in a broader patient population. They just care that the company can stack the deck enough to pass a phase two. Again, this comes back to the concept that so many of the drugs that are produced by the industry are actually not that good. They
Mm.
really only have small effects on the disease processes, and or they're repurposed drugs that are really happenstancedly poking at something you care about, and again, just not that large an effect size.
Yeah. So, also ends up in the drug approval process being politicized and captured, right? It's funny because like each time, like the administration and the vibe changes, or whether it leans more Democrat or more Republican or whatever, it's like, oh, the other side is now politicizing approvals. And before, under us, it's just like science and rigorous.
It's a sad world. I mean, the only thing that's going to change the regulatory system meaningfully, I think, is external pressure. And I believe that, no shade cast on the work that you guys are doing to in Montana and elsewhere to try to get people more able to actually use drugs prior to full approval. But the only reason those programs really exist and are thriving is because of the intense pressure being put on the FDA by the existence of medical tourism, to the point at which, the ring that really motivates the FDA cynically is that they look like clowns. If you can make the FDA look like clowns collectively as a group of, let's say, 300 different clinical organizations around the world delivering stem cell therapies, then hey, look, stem cell therapies of some sort come into existence in the US and the FDA stops, playing hardball on that quite so much. And maybe we can do the same things for gene therapy. But external pressure is the only thing I think that really shifts these big national, thoroughly captured regulatory frameworks.
Yeah. So where do you want to take Repair Biotechnologies?
Well, we're actually going for a rare disease path. So, I say what I say about the undesirable nature of these systems. And now my company fully participates in that system because this is the fastest way through for our particular favorite disease path. We're,
What do you
excuse
mean
me.
by a favorite disease?
Yeah, so we're working on cardiovascular disease.
Mm.
And cardiovascular disease is its own weird beast from a regulatory pharma culture point of view, in that it's very, very hard to put new drugs into this system.
Mm.
There's it's the FDA will be looking for 1,000-person phase three trials, and the only people who can really support that size of trial and the necessary years of follow up to see if you actually did affect the incidence of heart attack and stroke. The only people who can really afford that are the farmers, unless you go to one of the very small subsets of cardiovascular disease like familial hypercholesterolemia, where there it costs little enough and the trials are small enough and the regulatory system is favorable enough. It's shifted to be favorable enough for rare diseases to let people do that. And as you may or may not know, the rare disease sort of incentive path, which was originally set up to try to encourage companies who would never look at a rare disease to actually go do rare disease, and has now probably worked too well, insofar as, a very large percentage of companies are working on rare disease simply because that's the only way they can actually proceed. If you're a young company, how much can you raise? I can raise the amount to do a rare disease indication. I can't raise the amount to get approval for something that requires much larger clinical trials.
Actually been quite fascinated with that, right? Because there seem to be, especially the last couple of decades or last 10 years or so, to more rare disease approvals based on like very small and sometimes even just operational data, right? Sometimes the randomized study or larger sample size is not possible with rare disease patients.
Yes, and that's part of the excuse is that if your disease is 1 in a million, then good luck in finding 30 patients. I mean, 20 is a heavy lift, and maybe it'll take you 2 years
Mhm.
to get those 20 patients. And the incentives, of course, are set up such that rare diseases can gain approval more rapidly, in part because there's no point in trying to ask for larger, longer trials because they just won't happen. There just aren't enough of these people to actually run that.
Mhm.
Um, but also, it's sort of the rare disease sort of monolith has become this snowball rolling
So the
downhill.
interesting thing about that is, right, so you can, and I'm all for, right, to try and patients to try it and get it as quickly as possible. But then the challenge is, um, the way the system works right now is the FDA basically is not responsible for cost effectiveness, right? So that's CMS after Medicare and Medicaid. And they are almost guaranteed to have to cover it under a certain slew of rules. So then these rare disease treatments cost like 2 to 3 million
Yes,
paid by the taxpayer.
yes, exactly.
Under
It's a
normal
sort of
circumstances, I would say like, yeah, get it out to people. Let's learn more. Let's let them try it. But this way, it just crowds out innovation in favor of. And then you look at some of these companies, and I've uh, went down a rabbit hole and looked at some of these companies, and there's no scientists anymore on their leadership team, right? So these are like MBA-led companies where the founder has like 0.6% or 0.8% of the shares. So it's just like a way for the investors to make a lot of money.
That's exactly how well, yeah, one can't be too cynical about how biotech works, or indeed how any heavily regulated industry works. But this is the way
So
it
it's like
goes.
the FDA is both too strict and too lax in that regard. And then there's the insurance coverage, which is outside of the FDA mandate, but
Well, I think like the
it's
rare disease money question,
mm,
it's sort of a social compact has been set up whereby the payers agree that the rounding error of paying for these things, they're going to do it because they don't want to rock the boat.
yeah,
And therefore companies can afford the because you have to be able to charge your drug has to be able to make a certain amount of money over its lifetime for you to justify your company valuation to be high enough for you to be raising enough money to pay the regulatory costs of doing the trials. So if
it's
in
rational
that
for any participant in
yes,
the system.
in that argument, it's all the FDA's fault for making the trials cost a
Mm,
ridiculous amount of money.
mm, mm, mm.
And if trials cost a lot less, then you could have drugs. You have companies that are lower valuation. You could have drugs that cost less, and the whole thing would be better. Except no individual within the system, as you point out, is incentivized to change this.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of it's just it was piling up over decades, and just some of the regulation that stack on top of each other, and no individual was responsible for the confluence of things we have right now.
Yeah,
But on the other hand, you can also approach it from more optimistic lens. Right now, it seems things are looking good in our fight against cancer and
I mean, despite everything, progress is happening.
mm,
But
mm, mm.
if you pay attention to what's going on in the research field, what you see is that maybe 1 in 10 great ideas actually manages to accumulate entrepreneurs
Mm, mm,
and
mm, mm, mm.
sufficient funding to actually make it forward. And of those, a tiny fraction, manage to actually make it to the clinic because the people who are willing to put money into, getting your drug out of clinical trials or into clinical trials, they are very, very conservative, extremely conservative. They will pass on drugs that are in any way, you know, slightly more difficult. If you have, and they don't care about effect size. They don't care about whether it works or not. They care about how much money your drug can make. So, for example, a very safe small molecule that has a tiny effect on a disease will win backing every time over something that actually cures that disease, but is, let's say, a gene therapy. And it's a really big problem, and I'm not entirely certain what the cure is for that, other than coming back to my suggestion that we need a lot more medical tourism. And as the technology advances, that medical tourism is going to happen, because you can't have a world in which the regulators say it costs 50 million to
Mm,
get through a first clinical trial, but you can do it in GARM for 3,
mm,
right? That what that means is a bunch of people are going to do it in places like the GARM clinic in Roatán. And that data is going to be out there, and maybe it won't make it into the mainstream, but it will be available, and ultimately that is pressure
yeah.
on the system.
But you did say before that the medical tourism clinics don't have a strong incentive to get the data.
They have no incentive to explain to people anything, really. You should think of them as analogous to supplement companies. We have immense amounts of people using supplements. Do we know thing one about what these supplements really actually do? In most cases, no. The only trials getting conducted are academic trials. Any drug or any compound or any treatment that doesn't make a lot of money, it can exist for decades, and we still don't know if it really actually works or how well it works. Like red light therapy, do we know how well that works? Nope. Is
Mm,
anybody likely to run a clinical trial anytime soon that tells us? No. And the same for pick any random vitamin D3 supplement. Look at the existing senolytic drugs, the first ones that are starting to be used. Look at rapamycin. Are people going to run these clinical trials? Probably not. The only people who would do that are philanthropists or academics. And even there, it takes a long time to get that going, and those trials are never as big as you'd want them to be. So drugs that are maybe actually really good can exist for a long period of time in this sort of nebulous state of being used widely outside the mainstream system, and yet the data doesn't coalesce into something and that's another thing to be solved. How do you take the medical tourism world and actually extract data from it? And nobody's really solved that problem yet. But if you could, then you'd have an alternative path to clinical trials, because you would start to accumulate quite large amounts of data.
yeah. That's also ultimately why I chose, or why we're now doing a lot and starting soon in Montana, right? Because what makes data that would be generated in these offshore places or clinics, what makes it valuable is FDA acceptance, right? And the whole problem in the first place is, that the FDA would probably not accept it. I mean, they might if you're rigorous enough, as you're saying. Um, but there is a inbuilt credibility when you do it on like US shore or in Australia. That's just how it is. So I think, and there in Montana, we can sort of bridge the medical practice and get the outcome data and all of
I
that.
think actually there's a role here for building new organizations with a distribution of credibility. You don't have to have FDA credibility in
Mm,
order to produce a database of data, and people can look at it and make their own choices as to how
right.
credible you think that data
Yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah,
Again a problem to be solved, is what sort of clearinghouse could convince the clinics of the world to actually hand over
yeah,
patient data, and then in turn convince the rest of the world that this data is actually what it looks like.
yeah.
But if such a thing could exist, it would put tremendous pressure on the existing medical systems to actually be more efficient.
Mm-mm. Yeah, it's an interesting challenge. I was wondering if someone has tried that.
People keep talking about it, but yeah, it's a
Yeah,
tough problem. The medical tourism industry is very fractionated, disorganized.
yeah,
And I believe that will change in time, and it will change because we are moving from an era in which the only treatments that were actually out there were really treatments for severe disease. And there
mm,
just aren't that many patients. So you're not going to have a very organized industry because it's tiny.
mm,
But when you start talking about enhancement therapies like grow me more muscle,
mm,
AAV
mm,
follistatin, or telomerase gene therapy, slow down my aging in theory if it works. Then you start to say, okay, maybe my potential patient population is 10 times larger
mm,
or
mm,
100
mm.
times larger. And now you actually have the prospect of a really large um, sort of medical tourism industry, and that can start to change the nature of it, and start maybe we have a big enough place that you can start to get review organizations spontaneously emerging, and back to the databases, will there be people who want to collect that data and start
Yeah.
making something of it?
Yeah, I find that a kind of a very typical problem in like information sharing coordination, right? It's a bit of a stag hunt coordination problem in game theory, right? So every individual clinic has the incentive to keep the data for themselves, right? Because if you shared it, you don't yourself gain a lot from it. But if everyone would share it, the entire ecosystem, including that clinic, would gain, right,
Yep.
from better therapies.
Yep.
But every individual does not.
So they're all defecting right now, essentially. It's
Exactly. But you can overcome these coordination problems, as has been
yeah,
done
or
many
somebody comes
times.
in with a lot of money. I mean, like
Yeah,
a philanthropist who really believes in that outcome and knows how to do it would be
yeah.
one way through. It would not take, an amazing amount of money. If you put $100 million into that, you would have a pretty credible organization that could go out there and bully the clinics
Yeah.
and actually show benefit to the clinics who are sort of, under their umbrella, maybe.
Yeah. So now back to longevity, right? So what do you, how optimistic are you right now on whether it's possible to solve aging in our lifetime? And are the kind of things we're doing right now, the AAV gene therapies, is that what's getting us there?
Well, I think we're going to have a great old age, but we're dead.
Mm.
Kids who are born or kids who are kids right now, I think they may have the opportunity to live forever. We'll see. But things are going very much more slowly than they should be, in part because of medical regulation is not set up to do things rapidly, and it's particularly not set up to deploy cheap drugs rapidly. For example, senolytics may be adding 5 years to life, but we don't know. Are we actually going to find out anytime soon? No, because nobody has any incentive to run the studies that would see if these things actually work that way. There was a 140 something person study of a bisphosphonate drug that they treat osteoporosis with, right? This was in women. The people treated in that study lived 5 years longer than the people who weren't treated. And since then, it's sort of become clear that some of the bisphosphonates are actually senolytic. They're actually killing senescent cells in addition to doing whatever they're doing with the whole bone mineral density stuff that their original purpose. So there's all sorts of like incidental evidence to suggest that senolytic drugs are absolutely amazing, but nobody's positioned to take these incredibly low cost drugs like dasatinib and quercetin and actually really try them in humans and see what the effect size is. So this will continue until some philanthropist decides to step in and pick any number of other treatments like fecal microbiota transplantation. Resetting your gut microbiome is possible, and it clearly produces amazing benefits to health and lifespan in animal studies. Does it do the same in humans? Well, I mean, we'll see if somebody gets around to running a clinical trial, and somebody says they're going to in the near future. And there's a number of other things on the we think this could plausibly add 5 years to median human lifespan,
Mhm.
because that would not be absolutely insane. Um, it probably, and maybe some of these are drugs that are out there, they're just not, widely enough used for people to see that. 5 years is probably about the outer limit of an effect you could hide in an
A good
ordinary
effect.
drug that's used for like some age-related conditions. If much
Mhm.
more than that, you would probably start to see that showing up in data. But so if we have a couple of different drugs that are doing a couple of different things, then maybe we could gain 5 or 10, 15 years of life within the next, couple of decades. But actually proving that is
Mhm.
something that will take a long time, because I can tell you that the people will be out there using, let's say, senolytics to clear their senescent cells. They'll be using stem cell therapies. They'll be using exosome therapies. They'll be taking mitochondrial transplantations just as soon as those become broadly available. And, I have one of my investors is 80 something. He just started a company to do gene therapies in Panama, and he's done everything, and everything helped him. And he's actually shown meaningful regression of many aspects of aging. How long will this cause him to live? And he's an N of one. We need like, 1,000 80-year-olds to be taking stem cell therapies and exosome therapies and senolytics and like whatever else we come up with and see what happens.
Yeah.
And those of us who are 50 now, well, if I keep taking senolytics for the rest of my life and I
Yeah.
get to 80 and I don't have meaningful burden of senescent cells like an 80-year-old who wasn't taking senolytics, what does that mean? Does that mean I can
Yeah.
run a mile? Can I date college girls? I don't know. Nobody knows what this means, right? And even if I get a outcome, we still don't know what it means for everybody else.
Yeah.
right? So these studies have to be run, but they, in and of themselves, a real study that says something about lifespan is something like a 5 year,
Mhm.
5 year undertaking at minimum. So expect it to take a decade to get such a study funded, assembled, put together. So a drug would have to be widely used for at least a decade and probably longer because nobody would have thought about actually running the study for some years until after the drug was widespread. So even rapamycin is like one of the most well-known in the longevity community of like, calorie restriction mimetic type drugs, upregulate your autophagy. Allegedly, you're doing better. Do we know what sort of an effect that has on humans? It has 25% life extension in mice. What does that translate to in humans in this case? We've no idea. And we probably won't know anytime soon or anytime in the next few decades because it's going to take, how long is it going to take for a drug that no company is going to sit there and produce a version of this because people have tried and failed? Um, the actual drug itself is probably useful, but nobody's going to push it out to the community any harder than it's already being pushed by the online prescription services that are selling it. And if a researcher recently went out there and did a survey and found 300 people to talk to, and that's now, and this is a very hyped drug. So what's it going to take to get to like 100,000 people using this that you can actually go out there and run a trial on? This is not going to happen soon. So we have a knowledge problem. We don't necessarily have
You
a
sense a bit of
view.
optimism, though, right? So there's stuff out there that works. We don't
Yeah,
know which
there's
one,
stuff
but
out there that almost
yeah,
certainly works. We just don't know how much it works
yeah,
in our species.
yeah. So, if you were to talk to a young scientist who's thinking about being an entrepreneur, what would you give them on the way before they get started? What mistakes should they avoid? What should they?
Well, I mean, get that company started as soon as possible. It's almost certainly going to fail. So you might as well get that out of the way and
Yeah.
get the learning done. The doing is learning
Mm,
here.
mm, mm,
But just go out there and find something that interests you in the vast array of like, biotechnology that's and science. There's so much to pick from.
mm, mm,
There is
mm.
so much to pick from. And just go out there and do it. What's the worst that can happen?
Great. So anything else you'd like to talk about that we haven't talked about yet, or anything you
Oh,
want to tell our listeners about your work, or where to find you, or a shout out to what you're looking for right now?
well, obviously the focus of what I do is when I'm not getting stuck full of AAV is repair biotechnologies and attempting to assemble something that can actually cure cardiovascular disease since it's the major cause of human mortality. Would start at the top and work down type of thing. And yeah, obviously any assistance with fundraising and awareness and all of that other fun stuff for my company, I like that.
Listen, it was really amazing to have you on the show. We
Yeah,
learned a lot
good.
about how the incentives work or don't work and the coordination in biotech. And thanks for sharing your experience about the clinical trial you're doing here in Prospera with Unlimited Bio. And thanks for coming on.
You're welcome.